let's make a start. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me. So I am Rachel Bevan, so I'm Director of Statistics Division for United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok. So it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you all to the first ESCAP Stats Asia Pacific Stats Cafe, the first cafe for 2024. And we're starting this year actually by doing things a little bit differently. But before I go any further, let me also just say, let me start also by expressing our condolences to all of the staff in the Solomon Islands at the NSO there, because we're very sad to hear about the passing away of the national statistician Douglas Kimmie just a few days ago. So we would like to extend, I'm sure all of us would like to extend our condolences to all of the work colleagues, the friends, and of course the family as well at this really difficult time. So let me just start by saying that and say how sorry we are to hear about that. So here we are at the beginning of 2024, and what we wanted to do in this Asia Pacific Stats Cafe series is to do something a little bit different. Normally we focus on one topic for one Stats Cafe, but this time we're looking at the issue of data governance, and we were aware that it's a very big issue. And at our 8th committee, ESCAP kind of committee on statistics back in August 2022, countries agreed that we should do more work on data governance, and particularly to look at how we can share country experiences. And so that's what we've been kind of working on and leading up to this Stats Cafe. So we have gone away, we've developed a data governance kind of framework, and we did that with consultation with countries. We had an expert group last year where lots of countries participated, which was fantastic. And that really helped us to develop this framework. And then from that, we've been producing one-page data governance profiles. Having produced those, we really wanted to then be able to spend a bit of time really learning a bit more about what's going on in different countries. Because there are so many countries in our region, we decided therefore to split the Stats Cafe into sub-regions just to give us a little bit more of a focus. So that doesn't mean we're exclusively focusing on only countries in those regions, but it just enables us to kind of split things out and have a more in-depth discussion. So today's Stats Cafe is focusing on the Pacific region. So this is one of 4 Stats Cafes, just to say we're not covering the Southeast Asia region on its own, and that's because we'd already done discussions with ASEAN on that particular kind of topic. So that's the reason that we haven't covered that region, although we will include some of speakers from some of those countries in some of the other regions, because there's a lot that we all want to learn more about. But today we're going to focus on the Pacific countries, and I just want to introduce Jonathan Palmer, who's been a consultant working for us, helping us to pull this work together, and he's going to be moderating the session today. But I would also like to encourage people as well to really take part. We know that time is always limited on these things, but we do have the chat function, so you can ask questions as we go through, also make your own kind of observations, and we will also have audience polls, so to encourage you to write some things down and to find out more from you. So please do take part in those. Also, I think I meant to say the practical arrangements, which is when you're not speaking, try and turn your microphone off so that people don't kind of get any interference. We will also try and keep to time. We will have time at the end for lots of questions. But with that, I'm going to pass over to Jonathan, who's going to introduce our panelists for today and then take us through the discussions. But thank you so much for joining this first Stats Cafe of the year. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I'll just make a few opening remarks. But this is my first Stats Cafe. I'm sure that out in the audience there's some veterans, so forgive me if I'll learn the ropes pretty quickly, I think, but I'm really looking forward to this. And I thank ESCAP and Rachel, you and the team, for this opportunity to be part of the discussion about data governance it's a really important topic, and there's a lot of really interesting work going on. As we know, the data landscape, the data governance landscape is evolving and changing, and I think ESCAP's showing great initiative in promoting the sharing of ideas and the development of some knowledge bases. These one-page profiles, I think, will be a really useful resource for countries trying to understand how things are done elsewhere and what they might do in their own situation, and to inform this development of the knowledge bases. An excellent framework has been developed, because topics like data governance, they're tricky. Everyone might think that they're talking about the same thing, but there's a lot of nuances. So it really does help to establish some common language and have a framework that we can use to share experiences and ideas. So the bulk of this cafe is going to be devoted to some questions put to our panel, and then we plan to leave plenty of time for questions and answers from the audience, which you'll put in the chat box as we go whenever you like. And we'll, just to keep you engaged, audience, we'll have a few little polls of you. We'll ask you a few questions to try and get some information about your situation. So I will get around to introducing the panel in a minute, but I'll just make some further opening remarks, and I'll start by sharing a screen, just to bring us all up to speed, if you like, about what we're talking about. So key to this is this definition of data governance. So the definition we're working with is that data governance is defined as the exercise of authority and control over the management and transformation of data. And this authority and control is exercised, you would hope, in order to enhance the value of data assets and to reach the countries trying to understand. Might be things like being corrupted, or confidentiality or privacy being invaded. So that's our definition. But I thought I'd, at a very macro level, talk about the situation as I see it currently around data governance in the National Statistical System. And it's worth saying that statisticians really are major stakeholders when it comes to data governance in the government space. We're all very keenly interested in having a governance framework that allows statisticians and gives statisticians the authority to both access and influence the data that they need. And we should be very interested in the authority that are given to other agencies, because how they behave and what they do could well impact on the statistical system. I know a primary concern, and we may get into this in our discussion, is what will happen to trust in the official statistics system if other people are given the authority to integrate and disseminate data at the micro level, and they fail to do that well. So there are risks here. But let's start by looking at this sort of big picture situation. So, in the beginning, there are two types of data: administrative data and statistical data. And I'm confining this to government data, so I'm not talking about big data or private sector data, which is another set of issues in itself. And statisticians typically have considerable authority around the statistical data space. Through their legislation, they've got the authority to collect data. They can coordinate data collections. They've got authority to disseminate it, albeit with some restrictions. They can integrate data to create registers. And there are a range of, as you would be aware, conditions in our various statistics acts that are intended to make sure that this authority is exercised well, and that, burden, when you've got powers to collect, well, there's some restrictions to ensure that our population isn't too burdened. But basically, statisticians have a lot of authority around statistical data. When it comes to statisticians' authority over administrative data, then it gets a lot more murky, I think, and contentious in a way. Indeed, in many cases, we're still fighting for the right to have access. It might even be in the legislation that you can access administrative data held by government, but that doesn't always mean that other agencies cooperate by giving you that access. But generally speaking, most statistical legislation requires that the statistician have authority to access the data. Now, in addition to that right to access, we also tend to have authority to impose standards. We can, but these often that's done in a fairly soft way. The data custodians usually find it beneficial for themselves to apply those standards. And in some cases, statisticians have a legal right to be, or there's a requirement that they be consulted if there are changes to the data. So now I think we're in this space where there's a bunch of other authorities that are being questioned and debated, and it's really around who will have the authority to do a bunch of things that aren't necessarily all about official statistics. It could be more about creating data assets that are used for policy and research purposes. So who has the authority to integrate data for policy and research purposes? Who has the authority to share that data with researchers in a way that might be different to how we protect confidential and then official statistical releases? Should we give statisticians the authority to have more influence over data quality? And who do we authorise to act as service providers? There might be secure repositories or integrators of data. So a whole bunch of interesting issues there, questions and answers. The framework developed by ESCAP allows us to I guess, compartmentalise and make sense of the whole. And I hope you watched the little video attached to the flyer for this session. If you haven't, it's a great little resource. And I'm not going to get into any of this in great detail, but basically the framework consists of these elements. So firstly, what's the intent? Is the government, does the government have a vision for making better use of its data? What's driving that vision? Then what sort of rules and institutions are in place to act as data stewards and have the authority to do data governance? Who are the major data custodians? What are their roles? Then what's happening in the area of data sharing, promoting access and integration? Are there existing integrations in place? How are they managed? Who has authority to maintain those data integrations? And then I appreciate I'm moving through this pretty quickly, but I'm keen to get on to the panel discussion. Finally, we have a bunch of risks that need to be mitigated, and in most countries, you're seeing new legislation around data protection and privacy as part of the measures to manage those risks. So that's what I wanted to cover in terms of the sort of macro picture. And now it's time to get into our panel. So first, in no particular order, I'd like to welcome Peter Ellis, the Director for Statistics for Development Division from the SPC. Welcome, Peter. Next, I have Kemawali Nakwama, Head Statistician for the Fiji Statistics Bureau. Welcome, Kemawali. Rachel from a Deputy from Statistics New Zealand, Deputy Chief Executive for Insights and Statistics. I love the insights part of your title, Rachel. And finally, a former colleague of mine, Teresa Dickinson, Deputy Australian Statistician with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who leads the Data and Statistical Practices Group. And I think you panel, you're all pretty well known to each other, which is great. Should make for a bit of a dynamic discussion, I hope. And welcome, and let's get into it. So, but before I pose my first question to the panel, I'm actually going to ask an audience question. So Kai, could you throw up the first little audience question? We'll just take a couple of minutes to do a poll of you all. So you'll see this audience question in the chat box. Pretty soon. And the question is going to be, defined as the exercise of authority. Does your government have a clear strategic vision and intent for enhanced data governance of government data? So this is relating to that far left part of our framework. What is the intent? What are the drivers in terms of government vision around this data governance landscape? So do you strongly agree that your government has a fantastic vision for data governance, or are you somewhere else on the spectrum. Put your votes in, please. Oh, this is interesting. I never expect statisticians to strongly anything, actually. They're normally somewhat nuanced. So we've got quite a few agreements there. All right, well, thank you for that input. Feel free to continue inputting, but now I'm going to move to the panel. And what we've done is develop a one-page profile for each of our panelist countries. So I'll go back to sharing my screen again. And what I'm going to do is ask our panelists to give us a quick, what I call elevator speech introduction to their country profile. You know, the elevator speech is the one you're in the lift with the minister and you've got to explain something by the time you hit the ground floor. So what does that look like? I've got to get to the first slide. Right. So we'll start with Australia. Teresa, you can see that that profile there.
I can. I was a bit worried I was going to have to speak to careers for a minute.
No, I was going to throw that up as an example, but I've been flexible. So let's start with you, Teresa. A few minutes, just taking us through what you see as the highlights. And I've asked you to touch on three issues, haven't I? Is there strong demand for better use of data? And we see in our panel, our audience response that in most countries this is the case. Which institutions play leading role, and what's your role with what's the role of your NSO with respect to administrative data?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me to this. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. It's very much a topic of the moment. So, first of all, is there a strong demand for use of government data? Well, I think it would be fair to say that, like many countries, data is not just having a moment; it's having probably a decade, and that's very much the case in Australia. There's been a growing demand for data-based policy making and data-based service delivery priority setting. And this is just getting more and more prominent to the point where it really is becoming embedded that the government doesn't make decisions unless there is data available. That's not to say that they make data the only lens through which they make their decisions, but it's certainly very much more prominent than it has been. And we fairly recently had a change of government, and this hasn't abated. So this is not a politics thing. This is very much a view of how you develop public policy and deliver services to citizens. And with that demand for use of data and making higher quality, better decisions using data, there's been the growing accompaniment of the need for data stewardship and data governance. And I think it would be fair to say that we've always had a very strong sensibility around data security and data privacy, but the governance now is much more than that. It's about how do you create a system around the collection, management and use of data for the country as a whole. And so that's become much more institutionalized over the last few years. And there's a couple of institutions that play leading roles in this. The ABS is one of them, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But we have two institutions in particular. One is our Department of Finance that has, as part of its role, settings for how the government operates in Australia. And they have a branch there called the Data and Digital Branch that has the responsibility for policy setting around how data is to be used and the priorities for data development for the Commonwealth Public Service. And that is now accompanied by the Office of the National Data Commissioner. We have some fairly recent legislation that has put a scheme in place that enables much broader sharing of data between agencies and between our state and territory governments and the Commonwealth. And the National Data Commissioner and her agency have responsibility for administering that act and putting a scheme in place to make that happen. There's also then some other very key players, and I would say that the ABS is top of the tree here in terms of the length and type of experience that we have had in data management and data governance of our own data for many decades, and more recently, data from across the service has seen us. I would classify it basically as being the brains trust of setting up the systems that we have in Australia. While we might not have a deeply formal role,
typically have considerable.
We've had a team implanted in the Office of the National Data Commissioner since its inception 3 years ago, when they were still working on the legislation. We have worked very, very closely with the Department of Finance, and I think for the first couple of years we were a bit of a tutoring role for them. And anytime there's a new development in this area, such as Indigenous data governance, the ABS is front and centre in either leading it directly or supporting it heavily. The most prominent example of that is that we have a formal data profession now in Australia for the public service that has defined roles, a learning curriculum and various other aspects, and we head that up on behalf of the public service. So we have quite a prominent role to play, and I'll be happy to expand on any of that as we move along.
Great, thank you, Teresa, and that's a great place for the government statistician to be, isn't it, as the sort of orchestra leader, conductor of the development of the ecosystem. So we'll get into a bit later how that came about. Now we'll move on to, I've got to click in the right place. We'll move on to New Zealand, please. And Rachel, your elevator is going down, Rachel, thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Jonathan. Look, there's a lot of parallels with some of the points that Teresa made. I think certainly in terms of the vision and policy intent, there are a couple of strategies in the context for New Zealand. One is around data and another one is around digitising government services. They've been, I think, really key drivers for a lot of the approach that New Zealand has taken. And I think also that broader public service context has also been a key element of New Zealand's experience as well. In terms of the demand, yes, there's a lot of demand, and I think our experiences through COVID and last year's major weather events where we had cyclones that did a lot of damage, it really highlights the importance of data sharing and how government works both in a strategic way together with data sharing underpinning that. But also what we've seen is communities wanting to have more access to the same data that government does in order for them to make informed decisions, support their communities and realise their own goals and aspirations. So while we often talk about some of the risks that are associated with data sharing, I just emphasise a lot of the benefits that can be gained and that we're looking to achieve, and they encompass better public services, the recognition that our policy issues that we're trying to deal with as a country are multifaceted and they're complex. It's very difficult for an individual policy agency to address those issues on their own. They span different ministries and different departments, and so there is a real driver to bring things together and work together, notwithstanding that we need to do that in an ethical and responsible way. And so our role with Mark as the Government Chief Data Steward is to work in that broader context. And also what that's led to is us taking more of a clear role around data ethics. And being an advocate and a champion for data ethics and the responsible use of data within both the government system, but then I think more broadly in the New Zealand context as well. So yeah, that would be New Zealand.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and I really like that emphasis on the powerful benefits that can be realised by a good data governance ecosystem. And it's not it's something we're all dealing with, isn't it? Extreme weather events and pandemics, and in a way, I guess that's been on the plus side of those things, they've been a useful catalyst for developments in our data governance regimes. Kemuele, your profile is a bit different. Would you like to talk us through it?
Thank you, Jonathan. For us in Fiji, from the outset, we now have the much-awaited government support to conduct our role as a National Statistics Office. Having said that, when we look at the first question, is there a strong demand for better stewardship and the use of government data? You may note with the new government coming in towards the end of December 2022, we note from the statistical office that there had been a significant show of support from all sides of government and in acknowledging the use of statistics. Government have in many occasions during parliamentary sessions and during planning consultations have vouched for the need to strengthen the National Statistical Office and its activities, and also provide the agency some autonomous status to conduct its own affairs. Yes, we're expecting to be provided with the necessary resources to strengthen our role as a statistical agency. In terms of which institution plays the leading role, as role to be the official custodian of data and statistical information. Normally, all government agencies refer or
there's a requirement that they be consulted
to provide them with data. However, in terms of policies, it's all other government agencies that normally prepare its government policies. We notice that the respect for the National Statistics Office is growing and being acknowledged across government. As you all aware, in the
so now I think we're
time, therefore it's a matter of time for us here in Fiji. With the full support of the current government, we from our side, we need to increase the tempo with regards to the importance of statistics and its utilization, and then work our way through all government agencies that look at the NSO to either assist them with their administrative data collection activities or create a database so that we can share the information when needed. Naka.
Thank you, and that's heartening to hear that you're a respected and influential agency, and that you have that support for further development of your national or strengthening of your national statistical system. That's great. So that's our quick run through the three profiles. We don't have one for SPC, so we'll talk to Peter in a minute. We'll do another audience poll, please, Kai. So our next question to the audience is, I've got to get, sorry, I'm just checking I've got the right audience question. Yep, can you pop it up? It's our NSO has a clear mandate. Okay, it's up there now. I've got to scroll up a bit. Yes, our NSO has a clear mandate to act as a data steward for data used by our NSS. So that's a constrained mandate. It's you've got that authority to be leading data governance around data used by the NSS. So we'll move on to our next panel question while you answer that, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I've just got to get my mouse in the right location. Stop sharing my screen for a while. So we've got quite different landscapes. I'm really struck by the differences between how things have panned out in Australia and New Zealand. where there's recently been some quite significant changes. Teresa mentioned the new the Office of the National Data Commissioner, and Rachel, you're now the head of the data profession, and you've got a Data and Statistics Act. I thought it'd be interesting to explore how these new arrangements came to pass. You know, what was this something that was cleverly orchestrated by a very clever and politically astute government statistician, or did it just happen out of left field and you were told one day you had to take this challenge on? Because I think this is really interesting for a lot of countries. You know, what should they be doing to orchestrate the environment that they want in the future? So we might start with New Zealand, where your government statistician really has a whole new mandate and challenge around leading New Zealand's data management. Rachel, how did this happen?
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. So I was trying to reflect back, because this journey started, and Teresa was actually there for part of it. So feel free to chip in, Teresa. For me, certainly, it's about 2016, 2017 from memory. But it was really one of the key drivers, as I mentioned earlier, was this broader public service context. And there was a recognition that in order to have better public services, our Public Service Commissioner wanted to have more what he termed functional leadership roles. And so what those roles did was to have more joined up leadership and to take a role in a certain topic on behalf of the wider public service. So there were several at the time. There was one for government property, there was one for health and safety, data, which obviously is Mark now, and digital. So that was really, there was a conversation obviously going in that wider context. The government statistician, Liz McPherson, at the time, and the executive, we had a strategy which was about unleashing the power of data to change lives. So it was taking a really broad view of the role that a National Statistical Office could play in that wider system, and also contribute. So I think that also meant that our strategy and the strategic thinking of the time was quite aligned with actually what are the opportunities that are presenting. So Liz was appointed the government chief data steward alongside the government chief digital officer and these other functional leaders. And then it was really, that was, a mandate that was given, but then we had to shape that out. And that was quite the journey in terms of setting the strategic direction for that, putting it in that broader context, working with other agencies. There was competition amongst departments at different times for different aspects of this role. There was some pushback by them in terms of what did it mean for them and some of the work that they had been doing. And so that took, I would say, at least a couple of years before that sort of manifested into a much clearer role around standards, around as it's evolved now into data ethics and obviously leading the data strategy side of things as well. So from my memory, that was they were the main ones. It's taken years. But it really has evolved, and I think certainly we've also had a change of government, and I think there will be another evolution in where that goes. And I think the benefit of this session certainly for me was to be able to see the profiles and to be able to compare and contrast what other countries are doing, where we think actually we may have some gaps. And what that next evolution and how we want to influence it might be. So they were the key reasons from my memory as to how it came about that Mark holds the government chief data steward role currently.
Thanks, Rachel. And interesting, I thought your observation that it's taken years, I think that's something we all need to bear in mind. This stuff doesn't happen overnight. And this extra mandate that you've picked up, did it come with extra resources? Is this a path to riches for government statisticians, or something you've got to be worried about to act as data.
Not a path to riches. I think in reflecting on what we might have done differently, I think it's really important to. It's very easy for this role to become more about boiling the ocean. There's a lot that you can think about. It's, in terms of a vision for where it could go. And I think my reflection would be, just being really clear about the roadmap and those key quick wins in the beginning that demonstrate the benefit of it so that you can attract more funding. So we did get some in order to underpin some of the work that we've done, but we obviously we would like to attract more, and really tying that into what's the benefit, what's the impact that you've had. You need to find some quick, tangible wins alongside putting in those long-term foundations that deliver the broader benefits as well.
So if you want the resources, you're going to have to show the payback.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So we'll throw up our next audience poll. So it looks like we've all got a fair mandate to act as a data governor within the NSS. Our next question is, should NSOs play a role in data governance beyond the NSS? So we've just heard from Rachel that indeed the Government Statistician of New Zealand has now an obligation to provide leadership around the total data governance system. While we're contemplating that one, Teresa, you also have a very new landscape in Australia. You said that you've been involved as the orchestra leader and respected brains trust. So how has it happened, and did it take years like in New Zealand, or did it happen between Christmas and New Year?
Yes, absolutely, it took years. And in fact, Jonathan, you were here for a lot of this story at the ABS, so you can chip in if you think I've.
I don't think any progress was made until I left, really. So
I don't think that's true at all. So we did have I'll go back to pre-2015, where we did have a system of data sharing. So we were starting to integrate data and making it available, but it was a very slow, difficult thing. The data custodians, so the health department, the social services department, and tax and so on, were really just finding their feet in doing this, as were we. But there was a glimmer that this was possible, that it was possible to get better value from data by integrating it and making it more available across the system. But it was early days. And then in 2015, we had a review undertaken by our Productivity Commission. So we have a small agency that is tasked with looking at mechanisms by which Australia can become more economically productive, if you like. And the commissioner there has quite a lot of power to decide what they should investigate. And on the basis that there was a strong belief that sharing data between agencies was very, very difficult due to legislative and other constraints, he commissioned a piece of work to look at data sharing and availability. And in fact, quite unusually, he led that piece of work personally. The report was produced saying, making a number of recommendations that Australia should put in place a much more structured and valued and valuable system for making data available across departments, and preferably between states and territories and the Commonwealth as well. The process then is that the government makes a response to the recommendations from the Productivity Commission, and the person who led that response on behalf of the government was Gemma Van Helderen from the ABS. She went off to our Prime Minister and Cabinet for 9 months to do that work. And most of you, I think, will know Gemma either directly or because she was Rachel Beavan's predecessor at ESCAP. So she's well known. So that process resulted in basically the government saying, we agree to nearly every recommendation from the Productivity Commission. And in particular, we're going to set up a data sharing scheme. We're going to put some legislation in place that allows data sharing override provisions. So whatever legislative arrangements you have currently, and the ABS certainly has some about data sharing, this legislation can be used to share data if you have other provisions that don't allow for it at the moment. So an interim agency established with an interim data commissioner to draft some legislation and to determine how all this would work. And the ABS has had a team in place in that agency now for, I think it's getting on 5 years. It was a 3-year ramp up to the legislation being tabled, and a couple of years since then. And look, we did
from the SPC, welcome.
The technical backbone of how a scheme of data sharing can work based around the 5 safes. So we now have that legislation. We have designated roles for players in the scheme. So you can be a data user, you can be a data custodian, and some organisations can be a data service provider. The Bureau of Statistics is all 3. And look, it's finding its feet. It is very much a step change for how data sharing can happen. The first use case that is going through it now is a very complicated
Bureau, welcome.
Definitely the first thing that really needed to be done in anger with this new legislation involves sharing between the states and territories and the Commonwealth, and it's something that's been hard to do right from the start. The legislation now exists, but just having the legislation doesn't make these things easy. But what it does offer is, apart from the legislative benefits, it has really focused a lot of thought, a lot of attention on the value of data sharing and the cultural and capability uplift and change that is required. And it's started a whole new dialogue, and data custodians are thinking very differently, much more openly about what's possible. The workload for the ABS has increased enormously, not just because of this legislation coming into place, but in general. And there's very much more a sense now that there's a system in play, that there's a way that you can do these things with governance, with technology, and with a culture of data sharing that I'm really hopeful we'll start to see the type, or even further benefits, and we're seeing currently.
Thank you, Teresa. A few takeaways there. I mean, one, you mentioned the 5-year Dickinson, Deputy Australian Statistician. Be prepared to do this over the long haul. Getting a powerful agency to recommend that, you know, you need a new system and what it should look like is really a powerful strategy, isn't it? And then you need a Gemma Van Helderen as well. So that's a bit harder to find, I suspect.
Everyone needs a Gemma.
Yeah, and now you're reaching critical point with this application of the whole new arrangement, the sharing of data from states and federal. That's going to be fascinating to watch. Kemwale, in Fiji, we see that your government has a vision for improved management and use of data. We heard from you that you're a trusted advisor in this space and that there's an appetite for strengthening your capacity. How do you see the path forward in Fiji? And, you know, maybe there's some things from the New Zealand and Australian playbook that you might think about putting into your strategy. But what will FBOS focus on when it's trying to improve the data management arrangements and sharing in Fiji?
Thank you, Jonathan. Fiji, for the Fiji government had envisaged in its 5 years and 20 years development plan the need to address statistics in the country. This is way back around 2016 to 2017. And you know that within those 5 years and 20-year development plan, there's a greater need to manage public records and strengthen the increase of dissemination of data, strengthen the data collection capacity, and the creation and upgrading of existing subject-specific database. Therefore, I find that Fiji is heading towards the right direction with its intention to address data governance throughout the year, and use statistics as a lighthouse for future decision-making development tool. The Statistics Office has clearly set its pathway through its vision and mission. It's a matter of mainstreaming the nature of quality across people, processes, and the use of state-of-the-art technology to strengthen our collection and dissemination so that it's easily understandable information. At the moment, we are reviewing our Statistical Act. The Cabinet had advised the office to undertake a nationwide consultation and submit something before the next financial year. And we thank our development partners, in particular the Australian government, for assisting us in this exercise. We're almost done with our Fiji strategy for the development of statistics, which will set precedents on the way forward to entice the full participation from the relevant agencies associated with the use and demand for statistics in Fiji. As you are well aware, with regards not only for Fiji, but for all NSOs in the Pacific, our main challenges is the resources, both financial and human resources. As a growing economy and the debt situation we are currently in, with the competing priorities of government's development programs, we will settle with whatever we receive
The governance landscape.
this current financial year and for the coming fiscal year. However, that will not dampen our spirit in moving forward and providing statistical information that are required or demanded by our users. At the moment, with regards to data dissemination, we are strengthening our dissemination of statistics through the use of dashboards, and we are taking fairy steps with in showing our users what the population of Fiji was like in 2017 through the population, through the census for household and population in 2017, so that users better understand our role and what we do here at the Fiji Bureau of Statistics.
Thank you, Kamwali. I really admire your can-do spirit there and the conviction with which you're leading this work. You mentioned new statistics legislation. It's interesting, in our last audience poll question, 55% strong, so the statisticians have surprised me, they've come out strongly. So 88% of people strongly agree that statisticians should play a role beyond the NSS. Now, to do that, you're going to need different legislation. In New Zealand, it was the Data and Statistics Act. So it's no longer the Statistics Act, it's the Data and Statistics Act. So that'll be something interesting for you to think about, and I'm sure you're already thinking about it. Peter, you've been very patient, but you know your institution plays such an important role in helping our systems across the Pacific evolve and deliver on their mandates and their visions. How do you see the situation across the Pacific? And it's interesting, you know, we're well into our second round of NSDS, National Strategies for Development of Statistics. Do we need to evolve those now into being National Strategies for Development of Statistics and Data? But what do you see as the path forward for the Pacific, and how might SPC play a role around more active stewardship of government data?
Thanks, Jonathan. Those are great questions. I think an interesting point is to start with, like, as I was preparing for this panel, I asked myself, well, what is the state of data governance in the Pacific? And I realized that actually there's a real lack of systematic assessments in this space or in the region. And so that's one reason why this bit of work that from ESCAP that this seminar is part of is very welcome, because there is generally a lack of real empirical looks at how is data governance going in the region, what are its challenges, what are its strengths, what are the opportunities. And so my first answer is that, you know, we're not really quite sure what the state of things are there. The second thing is, if I can just go back up a level, one thing which we really see from our perspective is that there's this big demand for, if you like, more and better e-government in the region. And quite a few governments, for instance, are working on digital transformation in various sorts and improving the way that they're using technology in general. And this is much bigger than data governance, but it's got real implications for it. One of these is that the key risks in this space are closely related to data governance, but very much on the risk side of the two objectives in the definition we've got here. And that's things like vulnerability to cyber attacks and to a certain extent privacy breaches. And these are things which, as we saw recently with Vanuatu, for instance, can be almost an existential threat for a government to be under a cyber attack, particularly if they're going through, putting more and more stuff online and relying more on digital things. And but the other thing which we see, and this statistics, is that there's a lot of frustrations and desires for things to improve in terms of some of the basics of data sharing. And this is often not so much the a lack of will or even a lack of legal mandate, or sometimes there are governance challenges in the way, but there's often really strong practical constraints in the way. This is the data's on Joe's laptop and we're not sure where they are sort of problem, which we're all familiar with. And so we see data in the environment that's just in standalone computers and can't be shared with other government departments. Difficulty with getting the police records off bits of paper and into hands people can make decisions that might help people. And so these all have governance aspects, but there's also a really strong management aspect. And so I guess one thing I would say when we're looking at data governance in the region, so we don't understate the importance of the practical implementation sides of the management as well as the theoretical governance. Now, what about SPC? There's a few things that we actually really see in our role. And there's a really interesting mirror here of the question of what can SPC do for data governance in the region, and mirroring the question of, well, what can an NSO do for data governance in its nation, so to speak. The first thing that we think is we need to get our own house in order. And this goes well beyond my own division where we hold some sensitive data, but the Pacific community is also a key holder of critical and potentially sensitive data on things like fisheries, education, genetics, a whole bunch of stuff. And we have a governance of the fisheries, aquaculture, and marine ecosystems data provided to SPC by its members, and that's the official name of that data governance policy, which we're very proud of, but I believe we need to extend that sort of approach to data in other areas, including the sensitive microdata that we hold in my own area. We've done a data governance readiness assessment, and we're building our capacity with New Zealand support. We're going to be hiring a data governance specialist to try and improve that, our approach here, and indeed work with other crop agencies on how we can help build that in the organisation. So to cut a long story short there, the first thing we think we can do is be a model ourselves and get our own house in order. The second thing is we've got the Pacific Data Hub, which we just feel could be a critical institution in the future as sort of pooled regional asset and capabilities in data governance as well as data infrastructure and so on. And in the statistics field, this includes things like we've got the microdata library where we hold data under license agreements. We think that
in most countries, this is
an important part of the governance and sharing and management mechanisms for our member countries and territories. We've got dissemination tools like the implementation of .stat and a bunch of things where we feel that there could be regional solutions to national problems. Then I guess the third and final thing I'd say where SPC can contribute is we can be part of trying to tie some of these data governance questions into the regional statistical governance system, where we've got things like the Pacific Statistics Methods Board, the Standing Committee, Heads of Planning and Statistics. We see a role for ourselves in broadening out with the view and focus of some of those institutions to cover not just official statistics, but perhaps thinking about data more broadly. And the short answer to your question of do these strategies to strengthen statistics need to also be talking about strengthening data. I think they absolutely do. I think there's an open question of how we do that and how much you want the National Statistics Offices to be driving that as opposed to a key and critical stakeholder. And but I think absolutely someone needs to show some leadership in improving data governance and first of all understanding it and what the strengths and weaknesses are, but then also improving it just to see some of the amazing development opportunities which are out there.
Thank you, Peter. A lot there. I absolutely agree that your data hub is a critical piece of infrastructure. So that's a fantastic thing to offer the region. Your point about governments pursuing e-government and digital government, I think's really interesting one, because what I've seen in developing some draft profiles myself is almost a disconnect between digital government initiatives and the national statistical system. I'm not sure that the statisticians are necessarily as keyed into that digital government agenda. But the challenge obviously is to weigh in to make sure those risks that you rightly point out are jointly shared are well managed, and also to provide a bit of a lead.
Like many countries, data is not.
So I think that's a really key element. We're coming to the end of our panel discussion. I thought we'd finish with a couple of minutes from each panelist around their advice for government statisticians who are looking to have more authority to lead and facilitate the data management and sharing beyond the confines of the NSS. What would your advice be around how they might do this? How could they provide this leadership? What should they do? Might start with you, Teresa.
Thanks, Jonathan. Look, I think there are huge opportunities here, and all we have to do, I think, is play to our strengths, is to do what we already do and in our own worlds on a broader canvas, paint on a broader canvas. So the things that we're known for and that we're good at, privacy management, data management in general, managing the data life cycle, a reputation for independence, ability to manage technology as well, if not better than most organisations in government. We bring all that to the table and we say, here, we can support your endeavours to get better value from not just the data that we hold, but the data that you hold as well. And part of that is data integration, working with integrated data. And I know many of you were at the last Pacific Leadership Forum where we spoke about our integrated data program, MADAP, and which actually now has a different name, but people were saying, we want a MADAP. Well, work to get yourself one, because that's a huge value add for the system. One of the mistakes that we have made, I think, at the ABS and sometimes continue to make is we sort of feel like we're a bit hesitant sometimes and a bit sort of, please invite us to your party, and we'd like to lead it if you wouldn't mind. But to have that quiet self-confidence that says, no, we've got something to offer here. We're not seeking to take over the world. Let's work together on this. And that's standing us in really good stead. We found our feet on that, I think, after a number of years of not quite knowing how to make our pitch or work with others in the space, many of whom weren't as technically adept, but who had much more power in the system. So bring what we've got, work productively with others. That would be my bottom line advice.
And turn up at the party even if you're not invited, and have some useful things to contribute.
Yep, bring a plate, bring a plate of food, be prepared to share it.
Rachel, what about you? And what would your advice be, to a country like Fiji, who's perhaps quietly working on strengthening the NSS, getting better at what they have to do? What would your advice be?
Well, having looked at the Fiji profile, I think they do have a good sense of what they're actually trying to achieve. I think just to build on what Teresa said, what are the key issues or opportunities that you think your organisation can help with now, based on, you know, what your strengths are, or in the future as well. What are the potential ways that you think you can be helpful? And I think what that does is recognise the diversity of our organisations, our capabilities, and also what our strategies are. It really comes down to being sort of as simple as that. But in pursuing that, who are going to be your key partners across government? You know, there's been some real themes come through, which is often your central agencies, which would include your Ministry of Finance, your Public Service Commission or equivalent. You know, who are those really big players in government that you can, in a sense, work with on those issues or opportunities to get your place at the table. And I agree with Teresa. If we'd have sat back, and certainly in the New Zealand context, and waited for what might have turned up, it wouldn't have turned up at all. You know, we really had to have that conviction that we had a role to play, and that we had something to offer. In terms of what are we offering as organisations, I jotted down a few in addition to Teresa's. I think just experience working in a system context. You know, we do that as a national statistical system. You can think about that as an extension. You can go further to think about the roles that and the contributions we make regionally, as Peter does, together as well. I think often we have the best view or overview of the data landscape. Who are the key players, both nationally and internationally? We already have a network of countries that we can tap into to understand policy direction, what's working, and those sorts of things. And I think to add to the capabilities, often we have infrastructure that's of a scale that can really help underpin those things. That was certainly the case for us setting up our integrated data infrastructure and the longitudinal business database that Stats NZ hosts on behalf of others. And I think ethics and professional behaviours, you know, that's something that underpins the work that we do. And I think a lot of governments, a lot of countries are recognising the importance of having those things when you're trying to build trust and confidence in government and with others. So that would be mine.
Right, it's a great list. Kimwale, what would your advice be to other statisticians in the Pacific around which parties to go to? What should you take to the party? Who are the organisations you would recommend the NSO turn to get some influence and maybe resources?
Thank you, Jonathan. For us in Fiji, similar to the Pacific, we have our own way of approaching the issues with regards to have more authority and to take a leading role, especially in trying to manage and safeguard the use of statistics. For Fiji, it will be a different context altogether. For us, what we, basing from my experience before resuming the role as chief statistician for Fiji, I spent a large amount of 2023 at the office of the Prime Minister. And I noticed the fact of the lack of appreciation in the use of statistics for decision making. And that's how, having resumed the role, I see that it best to showcase what's the strength. And I totally agree with what Teresa had mentioned, to showcase the strength of the statistical office, whether it can manage data, sensitive data, especially with the multiracial countries such as Fiji, how we can best have the trust of the public to safeguard confidential information, the sensitivity that surrounds it. And my way of approaching it from what we are currently doing, as I've mentioned earlier, the use of dashboard as a source of information to showcase what was the population like in 2017. And at the moment, what we are trying is get hold of all the emails address of member of parliaments, both government side and the opposition side. And likewise at the office of the Honorable Speaker, to tell them that these are the links of the information or what we have compiled so far, and this is what was was contentious or sensitive with the last administration with regards to the population census. This is it. This is the scenario. This is the picture. Understand what or how we are or what we are as a nation, and also disseminate the kind of information to the permanent secretary level so that they can realize what the strength that we have as the statistical office. It's not easy to seek for more authority or to have a leading role,
but we have
but we have to prove it that
Yep.
we can manage, and we can manage and embrace that extra authority if we have provided the opportunity. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jonathan.
Thank you. So it seems that being able to walk the talk and having something credible to offer is really key. Peter, you mentioned SPC getting its house in order around the massive data assets it has. What would your advice be around how statisticians should have more authority to lead and facilitate data governance in their countries?
Well, I had these notes, but it's pretty much what everyone else has said. So I will endorse what they have to say,
Yeah.
and maybe sum up, or my particular angle on this, I guess, is that this should be our hour, right? It's like the things which we in our offices have been working on for decades are suddenly the things that everyone else in government needs to know and understand. But they're not necessarily going to know what they don't know. And so we will have to be assertive to help them understand that. And we've got many years and skills and systems and processes that have been built up about things like measurement error and validity and coverage error, making representative inferences without making a fool of yourself because you don't understand where the data is coming from, and statistical disclosure control and things like that. A lot of that's been developed in the context of surveys, but we can adapt it and expand it to administrative data, and we can help other departments from making mistakes because, you know, the statistics profession made a lot of those mistakes in the 1950s, and we've developed ways to get around it since then. And we've also got an understanding of that managing data for transactional purposes is quite different from turning it into information.
Yep.
And doing that in a safe way. And because that's what we do, we know how to do it. And we've got frameworks like data quality frameworks, the generic statistical business process model, total survey error, things of that sort, which again we've developed to deal with these things. This should be our hour where we've really got something to bring to the party, if you want to use that metaphor, and it should really get us a foot in the door for these broader discussions about the data governance, when people see the relevance of these things for both the objectives we're talking about here. There's the objective to use the data more and inform it. There's also the objective to do it safely and well, and you know, basically not cause big problems. And both of those things are going to have the attention of governments, and they're both parts of it that statistical organizations have immense experience.
Thank you, Peter. So I think we've got a consistent message there around seizing the day and going forward with confidence. We have a lot to offer from our decades of experience, and it's very relevant. So thank you very much, panel. Fantastic, fantastically insightful discussion for me. And we can move on now to audience questions. So please, audience, put your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to orchestrate them. And while we're doing that, we might pop up another audience. We'll do a word cloud this time. And the next one is, what do you consider to be the biggest risk in increased sharing and integration of government data? So if you could put a couple of words into the cloud on that. But please put your questions in the chat. You've got a fantastic panel to draw on here with no shortage of experience and wisdom. Now, can we see any questions coming up? Of course, any good moderator's got a list of questions at hand, just in case. So, Rachel, I might ask you, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to effective data governance? What words would you put in your word? Sorry, no, I'll stick with the question we've got up there about the risks. So what do you think are the biggest risks if you had to just put a couple up?
Some of the
couple up.
Oh, go on, Rachel.
Sorry. Cybersecurity. I certainly think the protection of data, I think that's really quite critical. And I think also the other one that came to mind was behaviour, culture and behaviour, because that's where people see, the actions that we actually take. We can say a lot of things, but actually you've got to have the actions to back it up. So when you do drop the ball, that becomes a big risk and undermines the overall goals of what we're often trying to achieve.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chip in on that?
We have in Australia, while we might not have.
Cybersecurity is a tough one, isn't it? I mean, we're all challenged at being demonstrably good at that, and the nature of the attacks gets more and more sophisticated. Is it just inevitable that NSOs are going to have to put a lot more resources and effort into being secure from a cyber threat perspective?
Yes, and we're already feeling the pinch there. We all of us have budget challenges these days, and the cost of cyber protection is one of the things that's raising our costs.
Peter, what do you see in the Pacific there? Peter, do you see this as really on the agenda, the whole cybersecurity challenge in the Pacific?
It is, and frankly, it's a really challenging one to deal with. And from my position in a regional organisation, one of the challenges, for example, is that in some ways this is a relatively new set of problems, and our infrastructure that was set up to help with it, to say support development in the region, is not necessarily tooled up for that. Like, there is no clear regional organisation, for instance, to lead on digital transformation. If the Australian government wants to come along and say, we want to put X million dollars into helping cybersecurity in the region, who are they going to talk to? They've got to talk to countries one at a time. And that, of course, these things are growing. Ministers meet together and they talk about these issues and so on. But given the scale and potential implications of getting it wrong, I believe that we've got a long way to go.
Great, yeah. We've got some great questions up there now, and I might start with this one around the use of these data governance profiles, because they're a great resource now, and we're developing a pretty impressive collection of them. Are they something used to get a foot in the door? Who would you take them to if you wanted to have a discussion about how things should work in your own government? I might start with Fiji. Do you think you'll find these profiles useful to have a discussion within government around how things might work in the future?
Thank you, Jonathan. As I've mentioned, we have already set the tone of how to address statistics in our national development plan.
Yep.
And I totally vouch to discuss it at that level, as I've mentioned earlier, in Parliament, because that's where policies and laws enacted or discussed, as well as through all government agencies. The need to talk more on the utilization of statistics and using statistics as a decision-making tool, especially for a country in the Pacific.
Thank you. Teresa, there's a question here about other agencies that could be leads and how do you work with them? Well, you've got this new office that really does have quite a clear mandate around promoting sharing of data across government. How do you work with them? You mentioned being somewhat embedded in them from the beginning. It sounds like a good way to go.
Yes, that's been very, very helpful, and of course that not only in terms of having settings for the work that they're doing that are very akin to what we already have. So that's sort of helpful from our point of view, but I think also helpful for the system. But the type of relationship that we've got means that you can have the difficult conversations about the difficult issues. And just as an example, this major piece that we're working on, where there's going to be data sharing between the Commonwealth Government and our state and territory, so on a scale that we've never had before. There's a lot in the legislation that is actually hard to enact in practice in that circumstance. And so we have needed a great deal of advice and guidance from the Office of the National Data Commissioner, which they in turn, of course, have sought from the Australian Government Solicitor. And we've had to have some conversations with them about, you've got to go faster on this, you've got to go harder, you've got to deal more directly with the challenges that the states and territories are putting up about whether this can work and how it should work. And I think that it's only because we've had that long connection with them and had that relationship that we've been able to work with them in that way. So from that point of view, that's very, very useful. And we've sort of proven ourselves, you know, the skepticism with which the National Statistical Office, with the ABS, was viewed in some quarters a few years ago has dissipated. And that's largely been because we've tried to be helpful rather than tried to be in charge.
I think so my observation would be one of the reasons people didn't turn to ABS as a data custodian of integrations of data was because they were concerned they were never going to get the data out. You know, once they'd given it to the statistician, they'd lock it up in their confidentiality rules and you'd never get to see it. So Claire, you mentioned the 5 safes model. And I think, Peter, I'd direct this one to you. I think, you know, if you're operating the data hub and you're making data available across the Pacific, do you see new protocols emerging around how that data might be disseminated to handle the needs of policy makers and researchers who actually need to interact with the data at a much more granular level? Is that something you've seen any pressure for, or is it still to come?
We form a useful point of contact or creation of potential contact, say, between researchers and governments. So researchers will come to us and say, oh, I can get hold of the microdata for this country, but not for another one. Can't you do something about that? And of course, we'll say, well, it's up to the individual countries. Yeah. But we, at the data hub with the microdata library in this case, we try to make it as easy as possible for the countries, if they want to take that decision, that they can host the data with that and make it available for the researchers by having, if you like, common protocols for access and so on, which are, you know, we use the 5 safes, and they're not dissimilar to the sorts of things that you would need to do to get access to either CERFs or the confidentialized unit record files from the ABS or Stats NZ. So yes, I think we've got a role to play in evolving that growing dialogue and helping sort of a bunch of countries and territories rise together by sharing good practices, sharing things which are working, helping say that this form of access is working for this country, maybe we can get it working for another, and so on. The other thing that I've just
last year's
the others were saying here is that while the NSO has undoubted skills and processes and systems which aren't going to be available to the rest of the government sometimes, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be appropriate for the NSO to be the host of the data, because sometimes those people will be right to fear that if they'd given the data to the ABS, they're not going to get it back. They're not going to get it back, for example, if they want to then use it to determine case recommendations, or
Yep.
should this person be referred to the police or something like that. So it would obviously be inappropriate for you to be getting data, then somehow it ever going back to the police or social workers or anything like that. Yet those people have genuine and legitimate data sharing needs and so on themselves. So I think there's a real role for the NSO to be involved beyond just of, oh, let us do your integration for you or something like that. But we can advise, even when it's not appropriate for the NSO to be hosting a shared integrated database that's going to be used for operational purposes, for example, the NSO might still have a role in saying, first of all, we've got experience with this sort of thing and making sure the data stays private, we can help you with that. And secondly, although we're not the main purpose of it, you're doing this because your social workers need the data or something, you might say, please, can we set this up in such a way that we can also get data for analytical purposes out of it? And it should always be possible, I think. So there's an angle there, but obviously it needs us all to take off our hats as remember, well, we're not the only people with needs here, and we're not always going to be the solution, even if we can help advise people in building their own solution.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that sometimes we're just part of the solution. And what we're seeing in a number of countries is a new governance arrangement where service providers are being authorised, if you like, or acknowledged as being appropriate service providers. So ABS might be, and Therese, you can jump in if I got this wrong, but I mean, ABS is an accredited provider of integration services. And so that means they can provide that part of the solution, which they do very well, and they don't have to do everything else, which might not be a good fit with their mission. Now, our word cloud came back with obstacles, and the big word, which didn't surprise me, was resources. And of course, this is it's our hour, it's our party. We've got a lot to offer, but don't have a very good dress to wear because our budget's pretty short. I like Kamawali's attitude. I'll come along and do whatever, I'll make.
And they encompass.
Can't we somehow make this opportunity an opportunity also to get some extra resources, because this is more work, right? Any suggestions? It's a tough one. Or are there things we can stop doing, which I always found very difficult in the field of official statistics? It's extremely difficult to stop doing anything to free up extra capacity. Rachel, you're in New Zealand. You're really good at getting by on the smell of an oily rag. Yes.
So I think one of the areas that we've been working a lot more on is sort of customer value, the value of what we're doing, and also the impact. And I think certainly in the New Zealand context, it's something that, we could do much better. And it's really critical when you go into those discussions about funding to be able to have those examples of where, because we can all talk about the activities that we're doing, but it's really going beyond that to say, what difference have we made, and using that as the basis to argue for more investment. And so certainly we've had a very small team, but we've had that as much more of a focus. And we've also we've made some changes recently to actually bring together our strategic engagement and for us Māori partnerships as well. And it's just that recognition that we need to have a much more joined up, centralised overview of how we're working with others, what we're trying to achieve, and then how that those outcomes are service delivered by the rest of the organisation as well. So I think there are some of the most simplest things like case studies. We all talk about doing them, but actually getting them done and having them as timely, up-to-date examples, I do think they're actually really important in being able to make that case for more investment. I also wouldn't be put off. We all do have tight budgets, but again, it comes back to what's the benefit that we can offer, and we can help governments understand and quantify some of the issues that they're dealing with and where perhaps the priorities need to go. So, so working with other agencies to be able to do that and support their work, I think goes towards making that case for investment, even when it's really difficult and tight.
Yeah. So working smart and not trying to do it all to, you know, be demanding of other agencies that might have the resources. Very interesting question here from Jessica Gardner around, are all data assets considered equal? And I think this new governance environment requires us to think about how we classify different data sets. It's very difficult, you know. So she suggested that there's some that are particularly sensitive, and then of course we might have some that are particularly valuable. You know, so do any of you have a framework that you've found particularly useful for allowing you to sort of avoid boiling the ocean and get down to some specific categories of data that you can focus your resources on? Teresa, do you have an observation there?
So first of all, I'd agree with Jessica that not all data sets are equal. There are some that are particularly sensitive and there are some that are particularly valuable. And that's a good example of gender-based violence has been particularly sensitive. And I would say that for most countries, the census data is particularly valuable. I don't want this answer to sound pat, but it is that one of the joys of working with the 5 safes, that you have a way of thinking about these matters. And because you are judging, you're having to do a risk-based judgment on who are the right people to have access to data, how much confidentialization do you put onto that data, what type of projects is that data being used for. You can set the screens for those gates for users to pass through at different levels for different sorts of data. So we have data on domestic violence as well, and that would be an example of where we are very careful about what sort of projects and what sorts of use that data is going to be put to. And we've got to be ourselves as a stats agency really quite careful there about not making value judgments as to whether the piece of work we think is necessarily a good piece of work and is going to lead to good outcomes. That's not our role, but will it be done to a high technical standard? Will the conclusions that come out of it be able to be validated, you know, as being good statistical work? Are the people that are going to do this highly credentialed in the area, and so on? So that's the screen that we use to help manage those sorts of questions.
Yeah, so maybe the answer isn't to come up with some classification which might always be disputed, but to work on the protocols and the judgment and capacity of the people operating those protocols to apply them effectively. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It wouldn't surprise me if in the future we do see some interesting frameworks for classifying different chunks of data. It's probably time, Rachel B, to wrap things up, is it?
I'm afraid it is. So I would like to say huge thank you, Jonathan, and to all of the speakers for what has proved to be extremely engaging session. I know that when we kind of set out to kind of put together these data governance profiles, we were really kind of, you know, slightly scrabbling about to try and find a kind of framework. And whilst we don't think any framework's perfect, I think the real value and what we've kind of really shown today is it helps to have something that we can kind of apply across different countries to give a similar language also when we're discussing these issues. I think what we found very early on in the discussions was that we were all using you're using the same terminology, but to mean very different things. And we'd seen that in some of the early presentations on data governance, where countries were being asked to kind of present their data governance framework and what was going on, but we really couldn't quite kind of almost understand them and compare them because they were all using the same language, but in very different ways. So I think we've really seen that value today in having a kind of framework, which then allows us to really have these much more in-depth discussions. And it does really bring out some really interesting issues. And I think, you know, I don't think I can summarize by any means, but I think what we have seen is that the context really matters. And the really important thing is to kind of build on what's already going on. And we've seen that obviously in kind of what Fiji were doing, but also in Australia and New Zealand as well. But I think another important message is it takes time. But if we start small and kind of learn from each other, that there are these real opportunities. And I think that was another thing that really came out as well in what different people were saying about that opportunity that there is now for NSOs to really kind of develop in this kind of area, and the fact that there's so much kind of going on in the area of kind of digital government, improving government services, improving decision making more generally, that this is such a great time for NSOs to really be at the center of these discussions. And we deliberately kind of did these sub-regional groupings of kind of cafes to give us more time, but as ever, it never gives us enough time to really go into these discussions. So I apologize that we haven't had we can never kind of get through all of the questions in enough depth, or even allowing the countries to kind of really share all that you're doing in these areas. And we know that we've kind of just picked out some highlights, but I want to say a huge thank you to all the panel and to our moderator, and then as well to say that we are continuing this series. So for the next 3 weeks, we've got other sessions. We've kind of slightly tried to time them so they start at different times. So we started this one quite early for us. And then as we move through the regions, we're starting them later and later in the day. But even though we've kind of each kind of sub-regional discussion has got a slightly different regional focus, I think there's real benefits actually to kind of listening in, to finding out what's going on across the sub-regions as well. So I hope that we will also see many of you back for the next cafe session, and I think we've already sent around the details on that, but certainly next week we're going to hear from the Republic of Korea, Japan, I'm trying to remember, Singapore and Mongolia. Those 4 countries. So we've got a really kind of great discussion lined up for next week. But thank you so much for this discussion this week, and also to say, we will, continue to use all of this information and these discussions to kind of actually help us as we develop this thinking, and also to feed into the UN Statistical Commission as well. But thank you so much, everyone, and thank you also to the participants for your active engagement, for all the questions, and for answering our polls. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.